All right, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Hunt Institute's August Race and Education webinar focused on uh, communities of color. The Hunt Institute is committed to having honest conversations about issues in race and culture that are embedded in and impact all of education. The Race and Education webinar series in specifically also is an opportunity to provide access to people and organizations committed to improving educational outcomes for marginalized and underserved populations, which is especially important for us today as we have this conversation. In 2019, a lot of things happened and was a year for us to kind of remember across the country and the world. While COVID-19 was the topic of discussion, something else important kind of happened. For the first time in American history, more than half of the nation's population under 16 identified as racial or ethnic minority. So there are major implications with that as demographics shift in urban centers across the country. The relevance of factors like linguistic and cultural diversity are becoming more important in our national teacher workforce. According to census data, Latino, Asian American, and Black populations grew by rates of over 20%, 29%, and 8.5%. This month's Race and Education webinar will explore what it is like to live in those on those margins in those communities of color as we celebrate the differences and discuss solutions that can kind of help increase educator diversity, because we know how important representation is for the students that we serve. So with no further ado, I want to kind of introduce our panel who we have for today, an amazing panel of amazing educators. So I will start with Sarah Lancaster, who is the 2022 Minnesota Teacher of the Year and made history as the first person of AAPI heritage to be named as such. She embodies what it is to be dedicated to her school community as she teaches in the same community that she grew up in. She believes, like many of the educators tuned in here today and across the country, that it is not only her job, but her responsibility to challenge her students to reach beyond what they think is attainable. She also consistently models what it is to be multi-talented, as she not only teaches, but she also coaches athletics and supports arts, including directing high school musicals and volunteering with youth groups outside of school. So I could go on forever about all of the things that she does in terms of how amazing she is and all the achievements that she's kind of compiled over the years. But the other thing I want to highlight before I turn it over to Sarah is that she has done all of this while being one of, if not the only, teacher of BIPOC descent in her district. So Sarah, can you please share a little bit about why this issue is kind of personal to you and central to the work you are doing?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I am coming to you from Onamia Public School District, which is where I work and where I went to school for my kindergarten through senior year in high school. And during that time, I didn't have a single teacher of color while I attended this district. So it was very apparent to me that of how important it was for kids to be able to kind of see themselves in their teachers and see themselves in the staff. And I remember the first time I had a teacher of color, I was actually in my college courses, and I thought that this is something that all kids should experience. And I just am really passionate about bringing that back to my district, bringing that to rural districts, making sure that students are seen and feel validated when they're in the classroom and feel safe. And I know that having educators of color is a really prominent factor in making sure that students can experience that. And so I'm just very passionate about building community, building strong communities, and building communities where we have representation.
I love that, Sarah. It's especially important for us here at the Institute as we are part of the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign. We do have these conversations. And I especially love the piece that you just brought up about not only that racial and ethnic diversity in education, but also some of that cultural, linguistic, and then demographic as we think about those rural areas. So I actually want to turn it over a little bit to Dr. Jaber for her introduction. Sorry, she is a global educator who is not only a presenter but an equity strategist, a keynote speaker, and has spoken for more than 20 years. She's held a variety of leadership positions in the U.S. and abroad. And she is a high school English teacher with district equity committee leader and board director for Our Voice Alliance, or OVA. She founded Education Unfiltered Consulting and works with schools nationally and internationally, focusing on curriculum mapping, strategic planning, custom tailoring, social justice curricula for schools, and anti-bias training, which we know is super important in today's time. She's also the founder of Arab American Education Network and ISTE community leader. So with all of those things happening, Dr. Jaber, can you tell us a little bit about why this issue is personal to you as well?
Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me, Sean. I'm honored to be here on this panel among other educators. And I think that for me, similar to what was shared prior is that like even in spaces where they are diverse, you often don't see Arab Americans. And so in a lot of those organizations that you listed, like OVA, like ISTE community leaders, I'm often the only Arab, the only hijabi Arab Muslim woman on a lot of those panels. And so I have never seen myself represented either in any level of education. And even as an educator, the aggressions against the Arab American community and the Muslim communities, especially after 9/11, and as we continue to speak about global events and the politics of our country as we are coming up on another election. And we already know historically our elections tend to really elevate fear in order to bring people to the voting polls. We have been the subject of many of those elections. And that is one of the reasons why normalizing educators of color, particularly Arab American educators, in a lot of these spaces who are people who represent something completely different than what the mainstream media has represented. We serve as role models to kids. Just really seeing, I think like I was at a conference recently where Sharif Maki, the founder of the Educators, Black Educators Collaborative, was being interviewed, and the moderator said, we need Black teachers, Black male teachers for Black male students. And my immediate thought was, no, we need Black male teachers for everyone, because a teacher is a nurturer, a teacher is a person who shapes the future of kids. And we need to normalize the idea that our teachers of color are experts and people who love kids and can do the hard work that is going to heal a lot of the single stories and the damage of those single stories in these spaces. And so I can stand up in front of a group of students and never say a word about my culture, my religion, or any of the things that make me different. I can just do what I do so well in the classroom and love my students, and that alone will shift their understandings of who they think I am, and that will give them something to compare to. And so for me, it's so important, because I think we often in education tell students, do as I say, not as I do. But by being in these spaces, leading and loving and doing the hard work, we are modeling what we want kids to carry when they leave our spaces. And so it's so important that they see that in Diverse Effect. It's so important for them to also see it as normal to see that diversity in a leadership position in their classroom every single day. And I always say, a lot of kids spend more time with their teachers than they do with their homework, with their parents at home. And so it becomes even more and more important for us to expose them to as many voices and as diverse a population through their educators and through their peers as possible.
Absolutely love that, especially as you think about the idea of modeling those behaviors for the students. I think it's very important for us as adults to create a space where students feel safe and comfortable to do those kind of things. And it just happens in different ways in different spaces. And as we think about modeling, very few organizations do it as well as Breakthrough Collaborative. And we have their their chief operating officer, sorry, recently named, so Alex Serna, who is a professional by and large, and then as we think about all the achievements he also has an unwavering dedication for educational equity. So a lot of the things that you just talked about, Dr. Jaber, he serves on the Education Trust West Strategic Advisor Council, is a member of EdLoc, is a Pahara Fellow, a program which is designed to support leaders capable of transforming the education system. And additionally, Alex is an active member of Youth Next Advisory Group at the UVA Center to promote effective youth development, and serves on the board for the Institute of Recruitment and of Teachers at Phillips Academy, Andover. He also serves as an expert in college access and educational policy, as well as he's been featured in the New York Times, EdSurge, Washington Post, The Hill, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, the Heshinger Report, and NACAC's Journal of College Admissions. So we have someone who is extremely renowned for his work with all these accomplishments. It's surprising that Alex actually never saw himself in education growing up in a low-income neighborhood in Anaheim, California. So Alex, can you tell us a little bit about how education became a priority for you and continues to kind of drive the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So I remember in high school geometry, I used to gamble in the back of class for quarters. So I would play dice in the back of class, and so I never intended to go to college after graduating high school. I graduated with a 2.1 GPA, never did an SAT, ACT. I was planning to go into the military to do welding. And then when I was 17, my high school sweetheart and I became parents at 17 years old. And so I had this kind of choice between, going to the workforce or to, for me at that moment, take a risk to go to higher education because I never saw myself in school. I was first gen. Um, and I went to community college, which I think was like the starting point for me and like really the foundation to help me succeed and thrive. It was also the first time that I had a teacher or professor who looked like me, and she was her name's Dr. Guzman, so shout out to her. But she was like she taught Mexican American history, so there was that aspect of it too. But she also shared a similar identity. She was Mexican American, and she like believed in me. And I remember going to her office hours once, and I asked her for books to read that like continue to push my thinking. And she's like, "You read this book." And one of the books was like Michel Foucault, which is like some French philosophy. And I was like, "Why are you giving me this book? I can't even read like basic reading. Like, why are you?" And then so there was something about that and about her support. And there was other professors like her in community college that really instilled this not necessarily just this confidence, but like this hope that I can continue to pursue my education. And so I was able to continue on. And I really attribute that to Dr. Guzman and like other folks who really supported me on that path. And that's why I continue to do what I do now at Breakthrough, is really thinking about the ways that we're not just diversifying the teacher workforce, but also thinking about how we're supporting students into their, for post-secondary success.
Absolutely. And we're happy that you were kind of able to do that. And I think your story resonates with a lot of people. Similar story to folks that I've heard across the country as we have these conversations. I do want to open the floor up to the entire panel for a question that kind of goes along those lines. So students of color are quickly becoming the majority as we think about those shifting demographics that I talked about earlier. Can each of you kind of talk a little bit about why that's important, and that they have educators that kind of reflect both the racial and ethnic diversity, but also like those cultural and linguistic backgrounds that we've kind of alluded to. And then if there's any data that you have to kind of support your rationale for diversifying the workforce, that would be great too. We can start with Alex.
Thank you. I mean, I think one, we know that there's a drastic disparity in the number of teachers of color that are serving students of color in the country. So we know that the gap is significant. I mean, I think to the question about why it's important, I mean, there's a lot of research that shows the impact that having a teacher of color has on students, like students of color's high school graduation, college enrollment, college graduation, social emotional support, like it runs the gamut. But I think as I think about my experience, having someone who looked like me really instilled this like higher sense of my aspirations, I think kind of broadened, and I really could see myself, right? One, pursuing education. Also, I could like I connected with those with those folks who I really shared, whether it was a linguistic, cultural, or ethnic identity. And so being able to have those moments, as folks here are teachers, like really having those moments where you're connecting with students, right? Building relationships, building that rapport and that trust. So in the classroom, you're really able to tap into that when you're supporting students' development and growth. So I think there's a lot that I think is attributed to the impact that having a teacher of color has. One source I will kind of shout out is the work of Dr. Travis Bristol. There's an amazing handbook, the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color, Indigenous Teachers, that is like, just has a wealth of information in there around the research. So I highly recommend folks look to that for more information.
Thank you, Alex. Sarah, Dr. Jaber?
You go.
Um,
Go ahead.
oh, okay. Yeah, just knowing that, especially in Minnesota, students of color, the population has been increasing by roughly 1% over the last 20 years, but teachers of color, the percentage has remained stagnant in Minnesota for 20 years. We have about 4% teachers of color in our entire state. And so when we kind of look at how that reflects student population, that is concerning because, like you mentioned, the majority of students of color is increasing, but what are we doing to meet that need? I know that there was a study done from the University of Maryland where, especially working in an elementary, this was concerning because fourth, fifth graders, having a teacher of color increased things like attendance. It increased things like math and literacy scores. It increased student engagement. And so all of those things that we look for in students, the achievement gap, asking, especially at this young age, how can we close that achievement gap and how can we increase these test scores and attendance and make sure that these students are having their needs met. And like it was mentioned previously, just the likelihood of going to college. Alex mentioned he was first generation. And so I think a lot of people really resonate with that because that is their lived experience. And having those teachers in the classroom who share similar lived experiences with these students is very important for them. It validates their identity. It makes them feel seen and heard. And so I think that really speaks to why we need to diversify the workforce.
I don't think I have a lot to add to what's been shared, but I feel like, I guess what resonates the most with me is schools are still very hostile places for teachers of color. And every time I have an experience, my first thought is like, what about these adolescents who don't have the tools or the knowledge to be able to name this and navigate it? And then I think back to my first experiences where the first aggression that I can remember from a teacher started at the age of 6, when I was 6 years old, and how those are not, we call them microaggressions, but they're not micro because they literally define your self-concept. And we already know that students who have a sense of belonging have 25% higher gains automatically. And so when we constantly talk about what pedagogical shifts can we make, what instructional practices can we change in order for us to get those students to make higher gains, the reality is having a person standing in front of them who can really relate to their lived experience, who can speak their language. And no matter how many books you read, novels or practitioner books, it's not the same as going through that lived experience and being able to really connect with kids on a real level. Like I sit in circle with my students and I say, here was my first experience when I was 6 years old with a teacher where I knew that my identity was problematic in that space and I didn't know how to navigate it. And we can actually have conversations that get kids to really think back and reflect at the first time they felt like their experiences were similar. And oftentimes, like I look back at my own education and I didn't start to realize kind of the impact of that marginalization as a student until I was doing my master's degree and really started reading a lot of the equity work that was out there and Dr. Love and, just a lot of the stuff that's out there that helped me to start naming some of those experiences. And then I thought to myself, how different would my life have been if I was able to have these conversations out of high school and walked into the world with my eyes open, as opposed to really trying to figure it out on my own during a high stakes period while I'm in college as a college student. And so that's why, to me, I'm able to have those conversations with my students at a high school level and really bring their attention to the realities of the world that are going to help them cultivate that global citizenship that's necessary for them to be able to walk in with a toolbox to help navigate some of those conversations and to be able to notice, name, and interrupt a lot of these things that we had to experience and learn firsthand. And I don't know that there's a lot of connection. Like, for example, I know that in my dissertation research, I focused on Arab American students because I live in the largest Arab American community in the country. And one of the things that came out is 1 in 3 Arab students are bullied by a teacher. And so my automatic thought is, that's only because of our demographic divide, right? Like that lack of understanding into the religion, the language, the culture, the different kind of expectations, the cultural expectations of different groups of students that we serve, creates this gap where we feel like what we are and who we are and where we come from is better than our students. And that's where we see that bullying from a teacher during a time where students are literally formulating who they are as people and deciding what the trajectory looks like. And how many of our kids actually have choice to deciding that trajectory? How many schools decide that trajectory for so many of our kids, right? And we're seeing that with the school to prison nexus. And so I think that there's so much that, like, I see my kids and I see their experiences, and that plays out into how I show up in these school spaces. No matter what, a person who's can relate through the lived experience is going to show up a little bit differently than someone who is well-intentioned, but still, no matter what, they don't have the lived experience that can back up the pedagogical, instructional, and just the connections that we can make with kids who share those markers.
Yeah, I love that. I know that the old adage is there's no experience like walking the path, right? So being able to actually have those experiences and have those authentic connections with students is something that definitely is something that's like uniquely positions educators of color to kind of be able to do. And I love the idea that you kind of mentioned in terms of, as a group, you all kind of mentioned the good things that kind of are associated with having educators of color, whether that be increasing that cultural competence for others, right? So like all students, we also think about that increase in attendance. When we have principals of color, we look at the decrease in suspensions, we look at the decrease in chronic absenteeism, increasing graduation rates. So like these are all the things that are kind of offered by having that diverse educator workforce. And then Sarah, I know you kind of talked about this earlier. Not only working in the place that you kind of grew up in and went through school in, and I think Dr. Jaber kind of talked about this a little bit just now, but schools, especially for students of color, can be a place where you're asking them to kind of return to a place of trauma if we want them to be educators. So, um, Sarah, as you kind of navigated all of that on your way to being Minnesota's Teacher of the Year, what recommendations would you make to policymakers who are looking to ensure that educators of color have the supports that they need, not only to enter the space, because we have these amazing conversations about recruitment and diversifying the workforce, but I feel like there's another conversation that needs to happen around retention. So how do we make sure like those places are not only school climates and communities where people can come into, but somewhere they can stay and thrive in?
Absolutely. So I served 10 years in my district as the only licensed teacher of color. And that was very isolating. And it's hard to commit to a district and want to remain in a district where it does feel so isolated. And so I think I actually had the opportunity to speak about this at the Capitol. We passed some legislation. The Teachers of Color Act was parts of that was passed in the omnibus bill that we passed in 2023 in the state of Minnesota. And a lot of the things that I spoke about passionately when I was testifying were things like underrepresented student grants and making sure that we support the pathways for our diverse youth, because I think this is kind of a longevity situation. This isn't something we're going to fix in a year or 2 years or even 5 years. We need to look ahead and think, how are we going to get our population, people of color, into the workforce? And it might not always look traditional. It might be tapping into our Grow Your Own program, where we take people who are working as support staff and look at helping them along the way to become an educator. And so kind of looking at the more non-traditional ways of getting people to the workforce, and then talking about retention, just creating the space and recognizing that there's a burden that comes with being a person of color that we carry every day. And then when we're asked to represent, it's both a space of pride and also another thing on the to-do list, because we are already so aware of what we represent. and how we hold ourselves in those spaces. So making sure that we have what we need to be safe and we have others that we can connect with. I know that my principal currently in my district really creates time for me to connect with the Minnesota Department of Education on some affinity groups. So being part of the Pan Asian Educators Forum and giving me time during the workday, during my contract hours, to do those sorts of things and have those conversations. I'm on my contract time right now, and my principal said, absolutely do this because this is important, this is meaningful, and this is supporting our students directly. And so just making sure that policymakers know that we need the time, we need the space, and we need the funding, because making sure that students, student teaching stipends, scholarships, all of those things can get people into the classroom that previously may not have had the financial means to be there.
I love that, especially as we think about the burden that we're putting on educators. Um, internally at the Institute, we have these summits that we hold, educator diversity summits. And one conversation that we've had is how do we get more educators to those summits? And one of the conversations is, well, how about we hold it at a time where they can attend, right? It's a big burden to ask on principals, on superintendents to have folks leave their buildings throughout the school day because coverage is already kind of hard to get, right? So like, how can we create these spaces where we're not adding a burden on educators and on district leaders. So I love that. And then Dr. Jabber, I know you've already kind of talked about this a little bit, and I love that you already touched on it. Our communities are one of the fastest growing populations in the country, especially when we look at our urban centers. What do we need to do to kind of create a space or a climate that ensures that all students have the tools that they need to thrive in the space? I know you kind of talked about some of the things you do with your classroom in terms of the circle, but what are some things that we can look at that we can kind of scale to ensure that all students are getting the supports that they need?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Arab Americans in particular, first we need to recognize that they're here, right? Up until recently, we haven't even been on the census. So even in conversations where we're talking about subgroups of students and their achievement or lack thereof, or needs that they have, specific needs, Arab America has been missing from that conversation altogether. But for all of our students, I think the really important thing is, how do we give students the voice and the agency in our classroom spaces and in our school spaces to become a part of the conversation? Oftentimes in schools, we're doing for kids instead of doing with them. And that's where we miss the mark, right? To add on to the question before, like, one of the things that I think is really missing in education is that oftentimes when we talk about equity conversations, it's at a teacher level, and it's about how can we get teachers to become more equitable. I'd love to see our schools become less violent spaces for teachers of color. And that starts with, like, who's the gatekeeper at the top of a school community, and what conversations are they a part of? From our Board of Education to our superintendents to the principals in some of these spaces, how are they engaging in ensuring that they're creating these safe spaces for teachers to be able to stay in these jobs? And then creating space for us to create space for our students accordingly, right? Like, it's a hierarchy, and it's a domino effect. I can't take risks and make space for my students to really find themselves, to become co-designers and co-creators in my classroom and have a voice, right? Unless I'm getting that support from the top, where I'm able to take those risks and know that I have support when the pushback comes, because it will, and it always does. And so instead of me deciding as an English teacher and an English department chair for our community here, what are the novels that we're going to choose that are going to be representative of our students, I'm a big proponent of, let's get students to create those texts, and they become the content designers. And instead of me deciding that this is a mirror for the students, I get to showcase the complexity of who my students are by them creating their mirrors that then serve as windows for other students, right? They're creators, their voices are powerful. And what better way for me to teach them leadership and global citizenship, rather than for me to give them the opportunity to engage with outside audiences and authentic audiences around the world, to tell the story of reclaiming their narrative as Arab Americans, as Latinx students, as students from any background, right? Like, and this is how we really build that deep appreciation for the diversity that exists, because a lot of our work is rooted in, I need to love myself first, and then I need to create space where we can humanize each other and build that community, regardless of what background you're from, because our communities are more diverse. And it's not enough to just be responsive, right, to the community that exists in my school. A lot of teachers come into our building, we have a primarily Latina community, and they'll say, oh, this is a diverse student body. No, it's not. We have a very high population of minoritized students, but we're not very diverse. And so it becomes even more important for us to also expose our students to diverse voices so that when they do go out into a real world context, or they're engaging through their phones in social media and other places, or as we watch a real genocide, the most live stream genocide happening in real time, funded by our tax dollars, they're able to say, where do I stand on this issue because I understand it? Where do I stand on the issue of global warming? Where do I stand on these big, huge national and international issues that even as a citizen of Illinois State, for example, I have a say in and I have impact on? And how can I choose that trajectory of where I want to be placed as far as what my role is in the world in this time? And so it really doesn't include, this is like being a teacher is a community-based project. It's not individual. You can't be an effective teacher if you don't create space at the table for your parents, for your students, and for that community to decide alongside you what that process looks like. And we're missing the mark oftentimes because we're functioning as gatekeepers and we're still deciding what that looks like with our students. And that's where we hurt teachers of color and students of color. So the more we can bring those voices in and to the table, the sooner we'll start to see that shift and that building of leadership ability and community engagement across the board, which is going to shift our entire communities. I always say the power is in our classrooms, not in Capitol Hill, right? Every president, every person, and a Supreme Court, every lawyer, everybody sat in a classroom first. And so if we're able to build that leadership in our high school classrooms, that's going to ultimately shift the entire landscape of our country as a whole.
Go ahead, Alex. I see you got something to jump in.
No, I was just giving snaps.
I'm sorry. Well, yeah, I mean, wholeheartedly agree with you there, Dr. Jaber, especially as we think about the power that our students hold. I know you named earlier Sharif El-Mekki, who is the CEO at the Center for Black Educator Development. They were able to capture and lift that student voice through a campaign called We Need Black Teachers, right? That was a campaign that was fully created by students and for students, right? So the more we can get those voices out in front of folks, I think the better off we'll be, especially as we engage in these conversations with legislators. And Alex, in your current role, you not only shape the next generation of educators in Breakthrough, but you also contribute to like vital data collection and reporting processes because you all are very good at doing that as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how Breakthrough leverages that data and the impact you all are making to kind of influence change, like we're kind of talking about at that legislative level?
Yeah. I mean, just to give some context, so Breakthrough operates within 25 regions around the country. We serve around over 10,000 students from like 7th grade through high school. And then we really bring together this model through our near peer model where we bring over 1,000 college age students who we call teaching fellows to the largest pre-service teaching experience in the country every summer. And so, we have a lot of data to share. We also have like a track record of over 40 years of having our program. And so we recently analyzed data from a comprehensive alumni report where we went back and really looked at our alumni who've completed our fellowship in our program. Over half of those folks went to teaching classrooms. Over 74% work in careers in education. Out of that cohort, every summer, around 79% are folks of color. One of the trends that we're seeing that is really, I think, exciting. I used to work at one of our sites. I was an ED at one of our sites, and I saw this firsthand, is that 20% of our teaching fellows are actually students from our program who are coming back to teach in the summer. And so you really see this amazing and like beautiful cycle of folks who've gone through the program and want to come back to give back to the like next generation of students from their communities. And so we look at data a few ways. One, we have, we have this data that we shared in this report, which I could drop in the chat. But I think to your question, I think it's important as we talk about data and like some of the advocacy work, whether it's the state level, local level, federal level, that we're also coupling that with storytelling. And so it's so critical for folks to understand like the really the vantage point and how we're thinking about the impact of having teachers of color or the lack thereof of teachers of color in the classrooms. And what impact that's having on students and their perceptions of their future and their identities. One example, I was visiting, I was at Stanford for a presentation and was able to catch up with a fellow who was in our program. She was actually someone who did not want to be a teacher at all. She went through our program as a student, and she did the fellowship, and did a career, like a shift. She's like, I want to be a teacher because I want to give back to students from my community as well. And so she went off to get her credential, and I was meeting with her in the Bay, and she was just reflecting back on how powerful it was for her to be in the classroom with students. You know, in her classroom, she was the only teacher with similar ethnic and racial background who spoke Spanish. And so there was like there was so many connections and so much impact that she was having on her students. So I think as we think about data, I think sharing the data, but also thinking about the stories behind that data. Because sometimes I think we look at graphs and we're like, the numbers, but it's really about the impact that it's having on people and their stories, and being able to share that as well as part of how we're thinking about whether it's system change or policies or the ways that schools are being structured and folks are being supported. I think is critical as we think about how do we continue to support folks of color and teachers of color in classrooms.
Yeah, I love that, Alex. I'm gonna throw an off the script question for you guys, especially as we plan on jumping into this next Q&A segment. So, audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in using the Q&A feature at this time. But we know communities of color are not a monolith, and that there are many, many ways to celebrate the differences of cultures. So can you all talk a little bit about how you're doing that within your respective spaces, especially as we think about this conversation that we're having today about like moving from the margins to the center, right? Like, how can we make these conversations more student centered, and then how can we also make these spaces a place where students feel comfortable having these conversations to celebrate these differences?
I'll say that one of the ways that I'm doing that in my school is by knowing that we have limitations with regards to our staffing. I bring virtual speakers once a week. Every Wednesday, we have a lightning speaker on a topic that we're kind of talking about, and there are people from all over the country who are experts in their fields. And then towards March, I host a one-day equity conference for students, again with BIPOC and diverse voices coming in to talk about areas of expertise where they can kind of highlight systems of oppression, and then give students the tools to be able to navigate and understand how they can play roles as citizens in order for them to disrupt some of those systems. And so just by bringing in, I've changed our research unit to research as a form of activism. And so students really pick something that's very passionate to them. And for that whole entire unit, they're introduced to doctors who did their doctoral dissertations in areas that are very personal to them, that have community meaning to them. So we're modeling by showcasing different voices that look like our students, and voices that our students probably would never have the opportunity to experience, but celebrating achievement, celebrating the joy that comes with following, like coming up with a passion project, following it, and then seeing the fruition and the fruits of that labor that directly impacts a lot of our students and indirectly impacts them as well. And so they're able to see them as models, but also see what our work looks like on the field outside beyond the classroom, and maybe be able to imitate some of those things as well. And so it's my students will tell you for the last 5 or 6 years that we've done them, it's their favorite day of the week, and they're always looking forward to hearing. And when they reflect, they're really deep adult conversations on a high school student level that they feel like they can connect with and take outside of the classroom. So it's learning at its best, I feel, these opportunities that we have to, and technology gives us so much opportunity for them to take in diverse voices, but also to create outputs that they can share with diverse audiences as well.
Yeah, I love the idea of challenging our students to not only pursue these areas of interest, but do it in a way that's um, supporting their growth and supporting their development. I think back to many, many moons ago when dinosaurs were on the earth and I was in high school, a lot of the things that I was most passionate about are the things that I was interested in, right? And I think as we are educators in the space and we have these amazing curricula and we have these amazing ideas about how to get students involved, I think some of the best ways to do that, and I think all three of you have said it, is like give them some space to kind of identify how they want to do that themselves. And it sounds like you're doing just that. Alex, Sarah, anything to kind of add?
Yeah, one, I really appreciate the question because it is important that we don't make assumptions around, like the monolith of students of color. I mean, like working in San Juan Capistrano, we work with predominantly Mexican American students. Those
Yeah, Alex, again, that story it resonates with me as I think about the importance of lifting voice of teachers and students. I feel like we're here in this policy space having this conversation, and oftentimes those are the last voices that are considered when we're creating these policies, as well intentioned as they are, as well impacted as they are. Sometimes if we just included those voices, we'd have a lot more success when we think about policy implementation. Sarah, anything to add?
I definitely agree. I apologize if there's like a noise in the background. My air vent just turned on and it's very loud in my classroom. Um, so I do apologize if there's like an echo behind me. I agree that power lies in student voice, and especially for children, the children that I work with, 6 years old, 7 years old, for them, it's in the storytelling, it's in the language, and allowing students to identify by telling and validating their stories and their identities, and then creating opportunities for them to create connections through that, making sure that they can see themselves in any visitors I bring in the classroom. We bring a lot of people to talk with the kindergarten, first grade, second grade in our building, and just making sure that if there's an opportunity to bring a person of color into the classroom who maybe isn't an educator, but a firefighter or somebody who works in our community, the mayor, that's equally as important as them having a teacher of color in front of them, because it opens up those pathways and it allows students to see themselves in that role. And then it's just also making sure that the curriculum is culturally responsive, because making sure that students can create connections through the materials in our classroom is so important. And in the stories, when they pick out what books they're going to read in my classroom library, I need them to see a variety of texts. And just knowing that they can do that in here is valuable to me.
You can't be what you can't see, right? So like I love the idea of making sure like all those classroom materials and all that student voice is kind of integrated into the decision-making process, not only at the classroom level, but at the school level, district level, and state level as well. The more we do that, I think the better off our kids will be. And now that we're into this Q&A portion, I know there was a question that folks asked earlier that I really wanted to get to. So the question reads, I'm wondering about representation among educators and how history of schools post-segregation is related to diversity among educators. Thinking of the work of Bettina Love and the Black educators that were removed from their jobs when schools were integrated, thinking about the celebration of Brown v. Board this year, right? The anniversary. How can we kind of think about that here?
This was actually something that I touched on when I was completing my master's program. We talk a lot about what happened to the student population when schools were integrated, but we don't look at what happened to educators of color, particularly during that time. And knowing that many educators of color were let go, and they attributed it to things like non-tenure or first in, first out kind of, but then when you look statistically at which educators were let go, it was primarily educators of color. And knowing that that still affects what's happening in a lot of districts, especially with this first in, first out. I know that that's a conversation that's happened in Minnesota quite a bit, is a lot of educators of color are entering the workforce. And then unfortunately, when budget cuts or staff cuts happen, they're the first ones to be let go. And so how can we create a support system that allows educators of color to have professional safety and, feel security when they enter this workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess to go along with that, there's also the sunsetting of ESSER funds and all the DI roles and initiatives that, that was kind of funding. How do we replace that in a world where we know those funds are finite, right? Like, I think the idea of LIFO, that last in first out, is something else that is going to hit states hard, especially as we think about all the um, folks that we were kind of able to bring in during COVID. So in states like Massachusetts, where folks were brought in on like emergency certs, like what is that going to look like as we continue in this space, where we know certain educators are going to have a different or impact as we look at some of these policies. Uh, I do like the idea of us revisiting this conversation and want to open the floor to our other panelists around the importance of this Brown v. Board decision and what happened kind of to the integration of schools, especially as we look at educators of color and kind of what we know happened on the back end of a very well-intentioned policy, but that was a very unexpected or unintended consequence of that decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. I mean, there's three things that come to mind for me. I mean, one, it's important just to know that there's historical context to like existing conditions and how we think about like what we think about moving forward and really understanding like the historical context that we exist within, I think is critical. I think there's something Sarah said earlier around the importance of diversity, like up and down, like and across, right? When it comes to, whether it's policymakers and school boards and legislatures and federal government, like I think it's so critical to think about how it is important for folks to be at that table when decisions are being made around policies that are impacting teachers or students. And so I really do think about how critical that is and how, that there are significant barriers, I think, to that. And just a shout out to organizations like the Surge Institute and other folks who really think about like building not just networks but like support for folks to enter those spaces, or Latinos for Education that exists to really think about placing folks onto boards. And so I really think it's I think it can also feel really overwhelming when we think about like all the system change, and it's always important, I think, going back to the impact that we're trying to make, and ultimately that this is going to be it's going to take time. It's going to take, this is decades and decades of like racism and like there. So it's going to take time as we think about moving forward, like what we need to do, and some patience, because there's always this urgency that we need to change things that I feel right in my work every day, that I'm like, we could do more. But I think it's important that we're thinking about this over the long term.
Yeah, I love that idea of that long-term thinking, especially since we know for policymakers, those terms are limited, right? As we think about people at the district level, they're not going to have those jobs forever. So I know there's always a constant pressure to show and prove impact, right? Like where's this all taking us? But we have to recognize that these things did not happen overnight and will likely not be solved overnight. So we will have to kind of roll up our sleeves and kind of stick with some of the things that are happening. I want to leave the floor open to Dr. Jaber for any reflections that she might have.
I don't think, again, there's not much that I can add other than like that. I always think about my locus of control, because when we think about systems of oppression, they just keep reforming themselves. They're really hard to break. And so sometimes when we're thinking at that big macro level, it feels defeating. And then oftentimes I hear teachers saying, well, I can't do that because the system is this. Or so I always think about my locus of control. I'm a department chair. I always talk to my department. What is our locus of control? I can't control things that are happening on a building level or a district level or a state level, but I can control what happens in this department. Let's think about what we can do within that locus of control. I always say educators are the most powerful people in the world. They really are. And oftentimes that power is stripped from us because our role is weaponized against us in so many different ways, especially when it comes to the politics. But we need to reinstate and recognize and reinforce and remember that we have the power, the privilege, and the positionality to make the changes that are absolutely necessary in our classrooms with our kids every single day. If you're an administrator, you have power and positionality. If you're a teacher and you stand up in front of students, if you're a high school teacher, we're talking to 120 to 200 students, depending on what subject you're teaching a day, right? And so we have the power to help those kids love themselves, to help those kids build community within each other, to help those kids understand the world. And ultimately, that's that long-term investment that I think we're talking about here when we're talking about making that long-term shift, right? And so thinking about those changes that we can make and then being active, like creating those PLTs and the support systems. As a teacher who has been in the field for 26 years, I need to make sure that I'm paving the way for younger teachers of color who are coming into this space by creating systems and support spaces in the building, and by starting the Arab American Educators Network, connecting nationally with other teachers in my affinity to make sure that they feel supported and connected, so that we are working together as opposed to everybody working in their own silo. Education as a field is very siloed. And so a big part of this work is how do we kind of dismantle some of those silos and come together as communities in order to support this work, especially when there's national pushback in the conversations against these very conversations, and we don't even know how that's going to play out. And so it becomes even more important for us to forge and create those systems. Once we recognize the history and we name it, right? How many people don't even know that that was an impact of Brown versus Board of Ed? And so it's the same question that I ask my students. Now that you know, what are you going to do with what you know? We know. So what are we doing to shift that? We can't, like, if we're going to sit here and dwell on how big these systems are in the past, nothing will ever change. But if we start to plant the seeds within our locus of control to cultivate that change, with time, we're going to see that happen.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Especially as we think about all of our individual roles as actors in the system, right? We do have some ability to be a change agent within our locus of control, sphere of influence, however you want to think about it. We do have space and time where we can kind of impact those things. So the last thing I kind of just want to leave you guys with is, you know, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but what leaves you inspired uh about education, and what leaves you inspired about educators of color as they seek their certifications, as they enter the field, as they look to kind of thrive in the space? What leaves you excited in this time for educators of color?
It's new that we're having these conversations. So I'm excited at the fact that we are naming a problem and that we are working to build pathways for them to thrive in these oppressive systems. That alone is going to shift, right? I can only see the excitement of my child, who's a high school senior, my youngest, when she had her first Arab teacher walking into a classroom, and that was revolutionary for her. And she came home and she couldn't stop talking about the intrinsic connections of language and culture and fasting, and like just the things that we take for granted sometimes, and having another adult in the space that can validate her identity at a time where there's so much trauma in our community and people are really having a hard time owning who they are in a space where everything that you are is problematic. And so just sharing that intersectionality with her was huge. And I think that the fact that we're having these conversations to make that the norm is such a big start. It's huge.
I absolutely agree. I think knowing what I wanted or needed as a child, and not being able to have those experiences, and then now being able to create those experiences for my students, that is the most rewarding and valuable part of being an educator. And so that really gives me hope when I see students light up about making those connections and saying, "Oh, my grandma does that at home," or, "Well, I know that Ojibwe word," and just being able to provide those things in my classroom, because that wasn't ever anything that I was able to see in my own classrooms.
I mean, I'm inspired by the panelists, so just a shout out to them. And Sean, thanks for facilitation and everyone who joined. I mean, I think there is, um, so much inspiration that we could draw from our students and the teachers that we work with. And so for me, I mean, I think that's what continues to keep me, there are moments of like, yeah, there's moments of like feeling overwhelmed, but I really do think it's, the opportunity that we're creating. I mean, I think about the impact that folks had on my life, and just the ways that folks are thinking about, like the folks that we talk about at Breakthrough, who are showing up and wanting to do this because they want to give back. I mean, like that's when you ask them, that's what they tell you, like, we want to give back. And so I just continually inspired by folks who are doing this work, and just thank you all for this opportunity to be in conversation with y'all.
And with that, I guess we can close the conversation, but I just want to thank you all for this amazing start to the conversation. And I know I kind of talked about this a little bit before we logged onto the webinar, but like this is just the start of the conversation for us. We are going to continue this. We have allies and advocates and champions in all of these panelists, but also in all the folks that are here on the webinar. So want to take opportunity to thank them as well. And as we look to engage them further in the space, you all will receive a key takeaways document that will include some of the high points of the conversation today, and also some resources that you can kind of tap into along with the video recording. And I want to thank you all for joining us. We will have another one of these race and education webinars on September 19th. So please, if you have the opportunity, join us then as well. It'll be a different conversation, but it'll be just as impactful. So looking forward to that. And again, just wanted to thank the panelists for today. You all had an amazing conversation, and looking forward to continuing the work with all of you in our spheres of influence or locus of control.